"Go wait in the back, nurse. We don't need you out here tonight." That was the sentence the arena's celebrity team physician said in the middle of the biggest night of the summer, in front of the whole medical suite, on a Saturday that nobody in that building would ever forget. And he said it the way a man waves off a vendor, without bothering to look up from the phone in his hand, as if the woman he was benching were a thing and not a person, as if she were a piece of old equipment that had cluttered up his suite long enough. And the woman he was benching, the quiet older nurse he had decided within his first season was too old and too slow and too far beneath him to work a real crowd, did not argue and did not flinch and did not say the one sentence that would have stopped him cold if she had chosen to say it, because she had learned a very long time ago that the people who need to tell you that you do not belong are almost never the people who will listen if you try to tell them why you do. So she set down the supply tray in her hands, and she gave him a small, even nod, and she walked off the floor toward the back of the suite with her spine straight and her face calm, and not one of the people watching her go had any idea that the woman the physician had just sent away had once run the casualty floor of a deployed field hospital on the nights when collapsed buildings and crushed crowds and the worst hurt human beings a disaster could produce came through the doors faster than there were hands to hold them. Her name was Nora Keene, and before that night was through, this arena was going to find out what that name had once meant. She was 49 years old. She had been a nurse for 23 of those years, the last 5 of them staffing the on-site event medical suite at a big modern indoor arena, a gleaming bowl of steel and glass that seated 17,000 people and hosted a concert or a game or a packed show almost every night of the week, and sat on the edge of the city's entertainment district with the nearest real trauma center, the better part of 40 minutes away across a tangle of surface streets and a single overpass. She worked the quiet, thankless medicine that an arena medical suite is built for, the fans who fainted in the heat of a sold-out floor, the chest pains in the upper deck, the turned ankles on the stairs, the dehydration and the panic attacks and the occasional broken wrist, and she worked the shows nobody else wanted and the late nights nobody else would take, because the work was honest and the suite ran better when she was on it, and everyone knew it, even the ones who would never have said so out loud. She moved through that building the way still water moves through a channel cut long ago, slow and certain and easy to underestimate, and she had a way of being in a room that made the room calmer without anyone quite being able to say why. And on the night everything began to come apart, she was exactly where she always was, at the counter of the medical suite tucked behind the main concourse, clipping a battered brass-cased field stopwatch on a faded olive ribbon fob onto the reel of her ID badge before she went out to do her job. The stopwatch was old. The brass case had gone dull and soft-cornered from years of being gripped and gripped again, and there was a fine dent across one edge, and the crystal over its face was scratched to a soft haze, and clipped beside it on the same faded ribbon was a small dull coin, plain metal gone gray, the kind of thing a person is given and does not buy, though no one in that suite had ever looked closely enough to wonder what it was or where it had come from. She checked the stopwatch the way some people check a watch before a long day, a small habit of pressing her thumb against the cool brass and feeling the weight of it and the faint click of the crown under her thumb, and then she squared the badge reel against her chest and rolled her shoulders once and stepped out into the bright, wide roar of a building filling with 17,000 people. She was a creature of small rituals, the kind of rituals you only build if at some point in your life the whole world came apart at once, and the small thing on your chest was how you pulled a crowd of the dying back from the edge, but nobody here knew that, and so to them the stopwatch was just an old woman's clutter, One more reason the team physician had decided she was a relic. The team physician's name was Dr. Sebastian Vale, and he was 41 years old, and he was, by every measure a marquee venue knows how to measure, impressive. He had trained at good programs and built a glossy sports medicine practice that put his face on billboards and his name beside athletes the whole city knew, and he had come to the arena as its head event physician, the camera-ready doctor who sat courtside and waved from the suite and gave interviews about player recovery, and he had arrived with the absolute, unshakable, frictionless confidence of a man who had been the most photographed person in every room he had ever entered and had never once been made to wonder whether the photograph was the whole of the thing. He was not exactly a cruel man. He was something more ordinary and more dangerous than cruel, which is a polished man who has come to believe that Polish is the only currency that exists, that the billboards and the title and the courtside seat are the same thing as the size of the person, and that an arena first aid nurse pushing 50 was, by simple arithmetic, a nurse who had never been good enough to be anything more than that. He looked at Nora Keene, with her gray hair and her unhurried hands and her battered stopwatch on a fraying ribbon, and he saw the past. He saw the way things used to be done before people like him came to make them shine. He felt, in the weightless, careless way a person feels it about someone they have never once imagined being, a flicker of contempt dressed up as a concern for standards. It had started small, the way these things do. In his first weeks, he had watched her quietly restock and rearrange the crash cart and the airway drawer, so the things you grab in an emergency were where a person's hand goes for them under stress. And instead of recognizing the hard-won logic of it, he had been faintly irritated, as if she were getting above herself by knowing something he had not told her. He had corrected her on a point of his own preference as if she were a student, and she had said, "Yes, doctor," and changed nothing about how well she worked, and that too had irritated him. He had noticed the stopwatch and the coin on her badge and made a remark about clutter and looking professional on camera, and she had said she understood and gone on carrying them. He had found out that she ran her own quiet drills on the empty afternoons before the doors opened, walking the concourses, checking where the spare oxygen and the backboards and the extra airways were stored, timing how long it took to reach the farthest section of the upper deck, counting the exit gates and the width of the tunnels, asking once in a staff meeting whether anyone had a real plan for a crowd crush or a structural failure during a sold-out event beyond calling the city and waiting. And he had laughed, a small, indulgent laugh, and told her that this was a modern, accredited venue with an emergency action plan and a relationship with the fire department, not a disaster zone, and that she should focus on her assigned duties. And every small, frictionless dismissal that she absorbed without complaint, he read as proof that she had no answer, when in truth it was the silence of a woman who had a great many answers and had simply decided across 23 years that they were not for him. So it had grown. By mid-season, she was the nurse he scheduled off the marquee nights. By the end of it, he had stopped saying her name, and on the Saturday the storm rolled in, he benched her off the floor in front of everyone, over nothing, to make a point about whose suite it was. If you have ever watched someone good get treated like they were nothing, and felt that quiet, useless anger that has nowhere to go, then you already understand why I tell these stories, and you already belong on this channel. Take 1 second to subscribe, because Unspoken Valor exists for exactly that feeling and exactly these people, the ones the room writes off, the ones who turn out to be the only thing holding the whole place up when it starts to come down in the dark. The folks who do are the ones who stay for the part where the world finally finds out who it has been ignoring, and that part is coming, and I do not want you to miss it. Because what happened in that arena before the night was through is the kind of thing that, if you had been standing at the back of that medical suite watching a glossy young physician send a quiet old nurse off the floor, You would never have looked at one the same way again. The storm had been building all afternoon, the kind of weather the city got only once or twice a summer, a line of violent thunderstorms marching in across the plains ahead of a wall of straight-line wind, the kind of windstorm the forecasters had a name for that most people had never heard. A great shelf of cloud the color of a bruise stacking up on the horizon and coming on fast. By late afternoon, the warnings were scrolling along the bottom of every screen in the city: severe thunderstorm, damaging straight-line winds possible, but the show was sold out and the doors were open, and 17,000 people were already streaming in out of the heavy gold light, and the building did what big buildings full of money and momentum do, which is assume that it was bigger than the weather. The arena had a retractable roof, a vast paneled thing of steel trusses and movable sections that could open to the sky on a fine night, and it had been left open earlier in the day for the heat, and the crews were closing it now against the coming rain. The great panels grinding slowly shut on their tracks high overhead, while the crowd filed in beneath, oblivious, buying drinks and finding seats. Nora had read the sky that afternoon the way she read everything, through the tall glass of the main entrance, and she had not liked what she saw, and she had felt, very faintly, the old prickle at the back of her neck, the specific awareness of a night that was getting ready to test something. She had said as much, mildly, to Dr. Vale, that a night like this, with a wind warning and a packed house and a roof that was only half closed, might be a night to have extra hands and extra gear staged near the gates, and he had told her that the venue had a plan and that she was not the venue, and an hour later, when she checked a backboard cabinet on her own initiative and was a few minutes late returning to the suite, he had used it as the reason to bench her in front of everyone and send her to the back to wait out the show. So she went. She did not slam anything, and she did not cry, and she did not look around at the younger staff for the sympathy that a person reaches for when they have been humiliated and need a witness. She went instead very still and very calm, calmer than the moment called for. A stillness that did not look like the stillness of a woman who has been broken, but like the stillness of a woman who has been somewhere far worse than this and has trained her body over and over not to spend its strength on anything that does not matter. For 1 second her eyes went flat and level and entirely without fear, and they rested on Dr. Vale the way you might look at weather, at something large and impersonal that you cannot argue with and must simply outlast. And then she gave the smallest nod, and she walked off the floor. One of the younger medical techs, an observant young man named Theo, who had worked beside Nora for a year, watched her go with a frown, because Theo had noticed, the way you notice a thing without being able to name it, that the nurse who had just been benched had taken it like someone for whom being sent out of a room was nowhere near the worst thing that had ever happened to her in one. She did not go all the way to the back and sit. She stood for a moment in the staff corridor behind the suite after the door swung shut behind her, and she did the thing she always did, which was to reach up, without quite deciding to, and let her thumb find the small worn coin clipped beside the stopwatch on her badge and turn it over once, the way she always did when something was about to go wrong or already had. That coin was older than Dr. Sebastian Vale's entire glossy career. It had been pressed into her palm in the gray dust of a collapsed building rescue at the end of the worst stretch of her life by a man with concrete dust ground into the creases of his face and other people's blood dried brown to his sleeves, who had told her to keep it because people who do what she had done do not get parades. They get to go home, and the coin is so that on the days the world tells you that you are nothing, you remember the nights you were everything. The stopwatch had come from the same man and the same place, and she did not say any of that, not to Theo when he slipped back a few minutes later to quietly ask if she was all right, not to anyone. She said she was fine, and that she would wait it out, and she did the one thing she could not stop herself from doing, which was to drift to the mouth of the corridor, where she could see out across the lower bowl and up to the high panels of the roof through the bright haze of the event lights, and watch those great steel sections grinding slowly toward closed against a sky that had gone the color of a deep bruise, because some part of her had never in her life been able to look away from a thing that was about to come down. There was a second figure in the small theater of Nora's working life that season, and he was not a clinician and never went near a patient, which somehow made him worse, because a person who can diminish you from behind a desk with a policy and a spreadsheet is a person with a very long reach. His name was Howard Lindqvist, and he was 54, and his title had to do with operations and guest experience and risk management. The kind of administrator who had risen through the running of big venues without ever once standing in a room where someone was dying, and who moved through his work like a man reading a profit and loss statement that happened to be made of people and ticket scans and liability exposure. He had heard about the medical suite nurse who ran her own drills on the empty afternoons, who walked the concourses when they were quiet and checked where the emergency gear was kept and how long the far sections took to reach, who had asked once in a meeting whether anyone had a real plan for the arena if a sold-out crowd ever panicked and crushed itself at the gates, or if the roof or a deck ever failed during a show, beyond the assumption that the city would handle it, and who had been told, with the same small, indulgent laugh she got from everyone, that this was an accredited modern venue with an emergency action plan on file, and that she should mind her assigned duties. Howard Lindqvist did not find her reassuring. He found her a liability because a nurse doing unscripted things and asking unscripted questions was a variable he could not put in a column, and the columns were the whole of his religion. So he had begun, quietly, to build a file. He had her after-hours drills noted as unauthorized presence in restricted operational areas. He had the small extra kit she kept staged in a cabinet near the gate concourse, a roll of supplies and tourniquets and chest seals, and a few field-expedient tools, noted as unapproved equipment outside the standard inventory. He had the stopwatch in an email as a personal item creating a professionalism and brand image concern in a guest-facing environment, a phrase he was rather proud of. And when Dr. Vale, newly arrived and eager to put his stamp on things, had stopped by the operations office to remark, half joking, that the suite was being held back by an old nurse who carried a stopwatch and a coin around like good luck charms and drilled for disasters that a modern arena had a plan for, Howard Lindqvist had listened with a growing sense of vindication, because here was an impressive new physician confirming everything his file already said. The write-up itself had come the very week before the storm, a printed sheet that a nervous junior coordinator had handed Nora in person because Howard Lindqvist believed in a paper trail. It was a formal counseling notice, and it cited the drills and the staged kit, and in a separate line, the personal items on her badge, and at the bottom there was a place for her to sign, acknowledging that she understood. She had set the paper down on the suite counter. She had reached up, without quite deciding to, and her thumb had found the small worn coin clipped beside the stopwatch, and she had turned it over once, the way she always did when something was about to make a mistake, and the narration of her own life had gone very quiet in her chest. She had looked at the coordinator's apologetic face and picked up the pen and signed the paper, because she had learned a long time ago that you do not spend your strength arguing with a system that is certain it has you figured out, and you save it for the night the system needs to find out whether it did. What none of them knew, what was written in no file at this arena, or in Howard Lindqvist's office, or anywhere a venue would ever think to look, was where Nora Keene had spent the 11 years before she had ever clipped on a badge at a quiet event medical suite. She had worn a different uniform, and answered to a rank instead of a name tag, and she had been the chief nurse of a deployed airborne field hospital unit, a fast, hard surgical and casualty receiving element that could be on the ground anywhere in the world within a day and set up wherever a disaster had outrun every local hospital. And the worst stretches of that job, the stretches that built her, were the disaster deployments, the earthquakes that flattened cities, and the crowds that crushed themselves, and the great structural failures that buried hundreds at once. She had run the casualty floor when a quake brought down a packed apartment block, and the rescue teams pulled the crushed out of the rubble for 3 days and nights and brought them to her tables faster than there were hands. And when a festival crowd in a far country surged and compressed itself against a barrier, and the dead and the dying came in by the dozen with the particular gray stillness of compression, asphyxia, and when a market roof gave way over 1,000 people, and the impact and the crush and the panic all arrived together, she had not just bandaged, she had run the floor. She had led the team that opened and packed and stopped the bleeding that would have killed a person in minutes, done the fast, brutal damage control medicine whose only goal is to stop the dying now and move them on alive, and she had learned on those deployments the specific terrible art of the crowd crush and the building collapse, the compression and the crush and the impact and the blind animal panic, all arriving together in a mass, the sorting of the many when you cannot save everyone at once. And she had learned out there the thing that no civilian suite can teach and no plan on a shelf can hold, which is how to do this work when the building and the weather and the chaos are all trying to kill your patients too, in the dust and the noise and the dark, with help a long way off on roads that were cut, with more dying than there were hands, and a way of standing in the center of all of it and feeling the panic rise in her own throat and setting it down deliberately, like a tool she could not use right now, and starting to sort. She had learned that in a true mass casualty load, the most dangerous instinct any clinician has is the urge to pour everything into the first person they see, because the first person they see is rarely the one who will die in the next 10 minutes. And the whole grim art of it is to move past the loud to reach the silent. She had learned to control a hemorrhage by feel, to read a crushed chest and a closing airway with her hands, to command a crowd of frightened survivors with her voice and turn them from a mob into 100 pairs of working hands. She had buried friends who never learned to move past the loud, and friends a bad deployment simply erased, and she had carried home, folded up small, the certainty that the worst thing about a disaster is not the disaster but the way it finds out, instantly and without mercy, exactly who in the place actually knows what to do. And there was a particular kind of disaster that had taught her more than all the rest, and it was the crowd, the human crush, because a crowd crush mass casualty is its own terrible specialty, different from any other disaster, and she had become, out there, one of the few people on earth who truly knew it. She had learned that when a packed crowd panics and compresses, it does not break bones first, it stops lungs, that the great killer in a crush is not being trampled underfoot, but being pressed so hard from every side that the chest cannot rise to draw a breath, that people die standing up, conscious and upright and wedged in a wall of other bodies, suffocating where they stand while the people pressing them have no idea and no way to back off. She had learned that the survivors you pull out of a crush are not safe, that some of them are carrying the silent injuries that kill an hour later, the chest that filled, the heart that took too long without air, the slow gray slide of a body that has been starved of oxygen and does not know it yet, and that the whole art of it is to look at a crowd of the upright and the walking and find, among them, the ones who are quietly dying before they fall. She had learned that an impact and crush event from a structural failure layers two disasters on top of each other, the falling and the crowding at once, and that you must read both. She had learned that in a crush or a collapse, you will always, always have more patients than you can treat in the first hour, and that the first hour is the one that decides everything, and that the only thing that gets a place through that first hour alive is a person who can hold the whole impossible shape of it in their head and not panic. She had run that first hour more times than she could count, and she had come, in the end, to a strange, grim peace with it, because she had learned that she was good at it, that whatever else was true of her, when a building came down or a crowd turned to a wall of crushing bodies and the world ended for hundreds of people at once, she was the one who could stand in the middle of it and pull most of them back. And a person does not forget a thing like that about themselves, however quietly they choose to live afterward. There was one night, out of all of them, that she carried more closely than the rest, the night that had pressed the shape of who she was into her for good, and she did not speak of it, but it lived behind her eyes every time she walked a crowded concourse. A great market hall in a far country, packed past any sane limit on a festival evening, had lost its roof in a sudden failure, and the people inside had panicked and surged for doors that could not take them, and the field hospital unit had set up in the dust and the dark of the square outside while the casualties came in a flood that did not stop for a day and a half. She had run that floor as a younger woman, under the chief whose coin she now carried, and she had learned, that night and that day, every brutal lesson the crush has to teach, all of them at once, learned them with her hands on the gray and the silent, learned to keep her own breathing slow while 1,000 other people stopped, learned that the difference between a floor that saves most of its people and a floor that loses most of them is not the equipment and not the doctors, but the one steady mind at the center of it that refuses to come apart. She had lost some of them. You always lose some of them, and you carry their faces, and the carrying is part of the price of being the one who can do it at all. But she had saved far more than anyone had any right to save in the dust of that square, and the chief had stood beside her in the gray dawn afterward, both of them hollowed out and silent, and told her that she had the thing that could not be taught, the steadiness, and that the world would spend the rest of her life underestimating her for being quiet, and that she should let it, because the people who needed to know what she was would always find out exactly when it mattered. She had never forgotten that, and it had turned out, across all the quiet years since, to be true. And then, for reasons she kept folded up small and did not take out at work, she had come home for good and traded the rank for a name tag and taken the quietest, honest nursing job she could find and let everyone assume she had never done anything harder than hand out ice packs and check blood pressures at a gate. She did not hide it out of shame. She hid it because she had learned that people treat you differently when they know, that they either lean on you too hard or resent you too much, and because the work itself, the actual work of taking good care of frightened sick people, was the same whether they knew or not, and she had wanted, more than she had wanted recognition, to simply be a nurse, to do the work and go home and not carry the disaster into every room she entered, so she let them write her up. She let the team physician bench her. She let the administrator build his file. She kept the stopwatch and the coin, and she ran her drills alone on the empty afternoons, not because she expected anyone to thank her, but because some part of her had never fully believed the comfortable lie that it could not happen here, and she had decided a long time ago that she would rather be the only one ready than be caught the way she had once been caught, in the dust and the noise, with the crushed coming and nothing in her hands. There was one person at that arena who suspected there was more to her, and his name was Curtis Boyd, the night security chief, a steady gray-haired man in his late 50s who had spent 30 years working crowds and gates and command posts at big venues and had an instinct for reading people that no one had ever put on his evaluation. Curtis had crossed paths with Nora for 5 years, and in 5 years he had noticed 100 small things the new physician never saw. He had watched her eyes go flat and calm in exactly the moments other people's went wide. He had watched her voice drop lower and slower when something went bad instead of climbing the way panic climbs. He had watched her glance once, automatically, at the exit gates and the tunnel widths and the choke points of a crowd every single time she walked a concourse, the way some people check their mirrors. He had seen her, late one empty afternoon, standing alone at the top of a vomitory tunnel with her lips moving, pacing off distances, laying out where she would put casualties and gear and a triage line if the place ever filled with the crushed all at once, and he had never asked her why, because you did not ask Nora things, you simply noticed that the answers were there, behind the quiet, and that they were not the answers an ordinary resume would explain. Once, a cocky young sweet-hire had rolled his eyes at Nora's stopwatch and her coin and muttered something about the burned-out old lifer who thought the arena was a war zone, and Curtis Boyd had taken him aside, very calmly, and told him to leave her be, that the day was coming when he would want to be standing exactly where Nora Keene was standing, and he had better hope she still bothered to teach him anything by then. The young man had laughed it off. Curtis Boyd had not been joking. The first sign that the night was going to be different came a little after the show began, while the storm was still bearing down, and the bowl was full and roaring, and it came over Curtis Boyd's radio in the flat-clipped voice of a man trying very hard to stay calm. The wind had arrived ahead of the rain, the leading edge of the derecho, a wall of straight-line air slamming into the city at highway speed, and out at the building the gusts were hammering the half-closed roof, and the crews up in the catwalks were reporting that the great panels were fighting their tracks in the wind, groaning, that one of the trusses was flexing in a way trusses were not supposed to flex. And everyone on that channel who understood what they were hearing went quiet, because there is a particular silence that falls over people who work around big structures when the building itself starts to make a sound it has never made before. Nora, standing at the mouth of the corridor where she had been benched to wait, heard the change in the air before she heard any words, felt the whole building shudder under a gust like a struck drum, and she looked up at the high steel grinding and flexing against that bruised sky, and the old machinery in her came awake without her permission, and she thought, with a calm that was its own kind of dread, here it comes. The roof gave way all at once, and from the worst possible place, directly over the packed upper deck on the windward side, a gust came in harder than any before it, and a truss that had been flexing past its limit finally let go, and one of the great roof panels tore loose from its track with a shriek of failing steel that the whole arena heard over the music, and it peeled back and dropped, and it did not fall clean. It came down trailing a tangle of rigging and lighting trusses and a curtain of cable, and a long section of it caught the top rows of the upper deck on the way, and a piece of the deck's own structure, the lip of concrete and steel at the very top, sheared and fell with it, raining down into the seats below in a roar of dust and debris, and the sudden terrible sound of 17,000 people understanding, in the same half-second, that the thing that could not happen was happening. For one heartbeat the whole arena was a single held breath, and then it broke, all at once, into screaming and motion, the entire bowl rising to its feet and turning toward the exits in the same instant, and the night turned into something else entirely. What followed the falling was worse than the falling, and Nora knew it would be before it began because she had seen it before. A crowd of 17,000 terrified people all decided in the same instant to leave through the same gates, and the gates and the tunnels behind them could not take them that fast, and so the crowd began to compress. The concourses filled and then jammed. the wide spaces narrowing to the choke points of the exit tunnels, and the people at the front could not move fast enough, and the people at the back could not see why and kept pushing. And in the space of a minute, the human pressure in the worst of those tunnels built to something no body could stand against. A wall of bodies pressed so hard from every side that the people caught in the middle of it could no longer fill their lungs. The crush had begun. And on top of it, scattered through the seats under the torn roof, were the impact casualties from the falling debris, the struck and the crushed and the cut, and over all of it the power chose that moment to fail, the storm taking the lines somewhere out in the dark, the great event lights dying and the bowl dropping into the dim red half-light of the emergency systems, so that the worst crowd disaster the city had ever seen was now happening in the dark. Dana, Nora Keene, was moving before the screaming reached its peak. She did not run because she had learned that running at the start of a disaster is how you fall and how you waste the thing you most need, which is the next 2 minutes of clear thought. But she came off that corridor wall and toward the floor at a fast, certain walk, and her mind was already 3 moves ahead, already laying out the shape of the night, because she had stood at the start of exactly this more times than she could count, and she knew, with a knowledge that lived in her bones and not her head, what was about to come and how little time there was to get ready for it. The roads would be a mess of storm and panic. The city trauma centers were 40 minutes away on a good night, and tonight there would be no good road between here and there. The streets jammed with the same fleeing crowd and littered with downed trees and lines. For the first and most critical part of this, for the part that decided who lived, the only care these people were going to get was whatever was already inside this building, and the only person inside this building who had ever done this before was a benched old nurse with a stopwatch on her badge. Dr. Sebastian Vale, for his part, met the catastrophe the way he met everything, as a thing he was sure he could manage. He had heard the roof go and felt the building shudder and the lights die, and he had felt, under the fear, a flicker of something almost like opportunity, the chance to be the calm authority in a crisis in front of a frightened crowd, and somewhere in the back of his mind the cameras that were surely already turning, and he had begun, briskly, to do the things that felt like command, calling the city and confirming that help was coming and telling his suite staff to get ready to receive casualties, and for a few moments, while there was nothing to do yet but wait and prepare, he looked exactly like the man the arena had hired. The trouble with being that man is that it teaches you that help is always coming and that the system always holds, and Dr. Vale had never once in his life been in a place where the system did not hold and the help did not come, and so he had no idea, none, that he was about to be. The first casualties reached the medical suite faster than anyone expected, because the people closest to the falling and the crush did not wait for anyone to come to them. They were carried and dragged and half-walked toward the one lit room they could find, the suite with its battery light still glowing behind the concourse, a ragged stream of the struck and the trampled and the gray, and behind them the security teams and the ushers began bringing in the ones pulled out of the worst of the tunnel crush on whatever they could carry them on, and in the space of about 10 minutes, the bright, clean, modern medical suite of a marquee arena, with its tidy little setup built for fainting fans, filled up with the casualties of a roof collapse and a crowd crush. There were impact injuries from the falling debris, the crushed limbs and the broken backs and the deep cuts. There were the gray, quiet ones pulled from the tunnel, the compression asphyxia casualties who had been pressed past breathing and were now limp and blue and barely there. There was the panic, taking hold of everyone, the walking wounded and the terrified unhurt crowding in together, a wall of noise and fear in a room lit only by batteries. It was, in every particular, exactly the kind of casualty load Nora Keene had spent 11 years learning to command, arriving into exactly the kind of unprepared place that the comfortable assumption that it could not happen here always leaves behind. And Dr. Sebastian Vale, standing in the doorway of his suite as the first of them came through, looking at a scope of catastrophe that no glossy practice and no billboard and no emergency action plan had ever prepared him to face, felt his confidence drain out of him in the space of a single breath. There were too many. That was the first thing, the thing the plan on the shelf had never made real to him, that they did not come one at a time the way patients had always come to him his whole career, tidy and scheduled and waiting their turn. They came all at once, a flood, a crowd of the dying filling a room, and there was no triage nurse calling them back, no order, no system, no way even to know who was hurt worst, just a rising tide of broken people and a handful of sweet staff and the awful dawning understanding that the help he had called was a long way off on roads that were closed. He tried to do what he knew. He grabbed the nearest visibly injured man, a fan with a deep bleeding gash to the scalp who was screaming and very much alive, and began, with real skill, to work on him, because working on the patient in front of him was the only thing his training had ever taught him to do, and he poured himself into that one loud man, while behind him and around him a dozen gray, silent, dying people slipped further away, unattended, and he had no idea, none, that by giving everything to the loudest, most visible casualty in front of him, he was doing the exact thing that, in a true mass casualty, kills the most people. He was a good clinician drowning, and he did not even know yet that he was in the water. If you've made it this far into Nora's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Up to now, you've watched a competent woman swallow insult after insult and keep her dignity, and that is something, but it is not yet the thing. The thing is what happens in the next hour, in a dark arena with a roof torn open and a crushed crowd's worth of the dying filling the concourse and the roads sealed and a polished young physician discovering that everything he is, the training and the title and the billboard confidence has just been swept out from under him by a flood he was never taught to stand in. There is no way you walk away from this story once you've seen what the nurse he benched does when the roof comes down and the crowd turns to a wall of crushing bodies, and the only person left who knows how to run a crush and collapse mass casualty in the dark is the one he sent away. Nora Keene reached the doorway of the medical suite, took one slow look at the room, and in the space of that single breath, she did the thing that no one else in the building could do, which was to see the whole of it at once. She did not see a dozen separate emergencies. She saw a system that had no order, and she saw, with the cold, fast clarity that 11 years had ground into her, exactly the order it needed. She saw Doctor. Vale bent over the screaming man with the scalp wound, pouring himself into the one casualty who was in the least danger of dying, and she understood the whole shape of the disaster in that one image, and she did not waste a second on him. She stepped into the center of the room, and she reached up to the badge at her chest, and she unclipped the battered brass stopwatch, and she closed her hand around the cool metal the way another person crosses themselves, and then she did the thing the stopwatch had been waiting 23 years to do again. She lifted her head, and she pulled in a breath from somewhere down at the floor of her, and she filled the room with a voice none of them had ever heard her use, a voice that was not loud the way panic is loud, but loud the way command is loud, flat and carrying and absolutely without fear. And she said, "Everyone who can hear me and is not bleeding to death, stop and listen. I have done this before. I know exactly what to do. From this second, you do what I say, when I say it, and we will get these people out alive. Look at me." And the room looked at her. That was the first miracle of the night, and it was not a small one, because a panicking room does not stop for just anyone. It stops for the one voice in it that carries the unmistakable frequency of someone who is not afraid and has been here before, and every frightened person in that suite heard it in her and turned toward it the way cold people turn toward heat. Even Dr. Vale, on his knees over the scalp wound, felt it land in the back of his neck and looked up and saw the nurse he had benched standing in the center of his suite with an old stopwatch in her hand, and felt for the first time in his glossy life the specific vertigo of a man realizing that the person he had written off as nothing was, in fact, the most important person in the room, and that he had no idea, none, who she actually was. What she did next, she did in under a minute, because she had done it 100 times and the moves were burned into her below the level of thought. She split the room. She took the wide space of the suite and the concourse outside its doors, and she carved it, with nothing but her voice and her pointing hand, into the zones that any disaster floor needs and no panicking room ever has. A place for the ones who would die in minutes without her, a place for the ones who were hurt badly but could wait a little, a place for the walking wounded who could wait a lot, and a place off to the side and gentle for the ones nobody could save, because she had learned long ago that pretending that last place does not exist is how you let it swallow everyone else. She grabbed the able-bodied, the terrified unhurt, and the lightly injured who had been standing uselessly in the way, and she turned them, in seconds, from a frightened crowd into a labor force, this group to carry, this group to hold pressure where she showed them, this group to go with the security chief and start clearing and calming the tunnel. You and you and you, each one given a single clear job that was suddenly the most important thing in their life, because she knew that the fastest way to stop a person's panic is to hand them a task, and that 100 panicking bystanders are a catastrophe, but 100 bystanders with jobs are the only workforce a disaster like this will ever have. And the room, which 60 seconds ago had been a wall of useless terror, began, under her hands, to become a floor that could save people. And then she went to the dying. She moved through that suite and that dim concourse the way she had moved through the worst nights of her old life, fast and unhurried at the same time, a contradiction that only the truly practiced can manage, and she did the brutal arithmetic of triage out loud and without flinching, putting her hands on one casualty after another and reading them in seconds. This one first. This one can wait. This one is already gone, and we cannot spend on him the minutes that will save 3 others, moving past the loud to reach the silent, exactly as she had been taught on the floor of a field hospital, in the dust of a fallen city by the man whose coin she carried. She found the gray, quiet ones first, the compression asphyxia casualties pulled from the crush, the ones Dr. Vale had walked right past because they were not screaming, because they were the opposite of screaming, because they were drowning in open air with chests that had been pressed past breathing and could not start again on their own, and she went to work on them with the specific knowledge that the crush had taught her, opening their airways, breathing for the ones who had stopped, getting oxygen into bodies that had been starved of it, watching for the ones whose hearts had gone too long without air, and starting compressions on a young man whose pulse had failed, and timing the cycles on the old brass stopwatch in her hand. The same stopwatch the physician had mocked as clutter, now ticking out the rhythm of a human life being pulled back across the line. Theo, the young tech, found her in the middle of it, and instead of freezing the way half the staff had frozen, he did the smartest thing of his young life, which was to attach himself to her and become her hands, and she used him, fast and clear. Do this, hold here, count to me, go get me the stage kit from the gate cabinet, the one operations wrote her up for, and Theo ran and came back with the roll of supplies and tourniquets and chest seals that Howard Lindqvist had flagged as unapproved equipment, and Nora opened it, and it was exactly precisely what the night needed, and Theo would remember for the rest of his life the moment he understood that the contraband kit in his arms was the difference between people living and dying, and that the woman beside him had known for years, that this night was coming. She put a tourniquet on a man whose leg had been crushed and opened by falling steel, high and tight, and timed it on the stopwatch and called the time aloud so it would not be forgotten, the way you do it when you have done it for real. She read a man's caved chest with her hands and felt the air leaking where it should not be, and sealed it with a chest seal from the kit, and his breathing eased, and Theo watched a man who had been suffocating start to live, and did not understand yet how she had known, only that she had. There was a man near the foot of the worst pile, an older fan named Walter, who had been in the top rows when the deck sheared and had ridden the debris down and come to rest with a steel strut across his legs, and a crowd of well-meaning strangers about to do the one thing that would have killed him, which was to lift it off in a rush. Nora saw it from across the concourse and got there in the few seconds she had, and she stopped them, hard, because she knew the thing they did not, that a limb crushed and pinned for any length of time builds up a poison behind the pressure, and that lifting the weight all at once can send that poison into the heart in a wave and stop it cold, that the rescue itself becomes the killing if you do it wrong and too fast. So she slowed them down. She got a tourniquet on above the crush before the weight came off, high and tight, and timed it on the brass stopwatch and called the time aloud so no one would forget when it had gone on, and only then, on her count, in a slow controlled lift and not a panicked heave, did she let them raise the strut, and she rode the moment with her hand on the man's pulse, ready, and the poison did not take him, and Walter lived, an old man who would go home to his family because a nurse had known to do the rescue slowly when every instinct in a frightened crowd screamed to do it fast. Theo, watching, filed it away with all the rest. One more thing that an arena first aid nurse had no business knowing, and this one knew cold, and the understanding kept growing in him, the size of the thing he was standing next to, and as she worked, the thing that had been hidden for 5 years began, without her ever saying a word about it, to surface, because a person cannot do what Nora Keene was doing and have it be explained by an arena first aid job. It was in the language. She gave orders in the clipped, layered, unmistakable grammar of someone who had run mass casualty floors for a living. The specific words and the specific sequence, the way she called a triage category, the way she designated a casualty collection point, the way she said move past the loud, find the silent without ever having to think about it, it was in the hands. She did procedures by feel in the dark that the staff had only ever read about, found a tension building in a quiet woman's chest, a deadly pressure that would have stopped her heart in minutes, and decompressed it with a needle in one clean, practiced motion that bought the woman an hour she would otherwise never have had, and the staff who saw it went silent, because that was not a thing an arena nurse knew how to do. That was a thing done by people who had done it in places without lights. It was in the calm. Above all, it was in the calm, the impossible, total, contagious calm of a person standing in the center of hell with 100 people dying around her, and her own pulse slow and her own voice level, a calm that does not come from temperament, a calm that can only be built, one terrible night at a time, in places most of the people in that room could not have survived. And one by one, the staff who had pitied her and the staff who had taken their cues from the physician's contempt began to understand that they had been wrong about her in some enormous way they could not yet name, that the quiet old nurse with the stopwatch was not a relic at all, that she was, in fact, the most dangerous and capable human being any of them had ever stood next to, and that she had been hiding in plain sight at the back of their suite the entire time. There was a moment, perhaps 20 minutes into it, when the disaster tried to take her command away from her, the way disasters do, with a fresh wave. The security teams clearing the worst of the tunnel crush broke through to the densest part of it at last and found, packed into that choke point, dozens more of the gray and the silent, the deep core of the compression, and they came flooding into the concourse all at once, a second surge of casualties on top of the first, and for 1 second the whole fragile order Nora had built trembled on the edge of collapsing back into chaos. And in that second she did the thing that separates the people who can run a disaster from the people who merely survive one, which is that she did not let the new wave reset her. She absorbed it. She kept her zones and she kept her stopwatch, and she resorted on the fly, folding the new casualties into the system she had already built, sending the worst of the new gray ones to the place she had made for the dying now, and the rest down the line, and she pulled 3 more bystanders in and gave them jobs and widened the floor to hold the new load, and the order held because she had built it deep enough to flex, the way she had learned to build it on nights far worse than this one. And Curtis Boyd, the security chief, working beside her now, clearing and carrying and following her direction without question, because he had known for 5 years that this was who she was, looked at the way she folded a second catastrophe into a system already at its limit and did not break, and he thought, this is who she has been the whole time, and not one of us had any idea. And then the building tried to kill them too, which was the part Nora had been waiting for the whole time, because she had learned on her worst deployments that a structure that has already failed once is a structure that is telling you it will fail again, and that the second collapse is the one that takes the rescuers. High above the windward side, where the panel had already torn loose, the wind got under the wounded edge of the roof again, and a long groan of stressed steel rolled down through the whole bowl, and a second piece of rigging let go and swung down on its cables in a great pendulum arc over a section of seats where a knot of ushers and good-hearted strangers were still dragging the trapped out of the debris, and people screamed and scattered. And for 1 second, the whole rescue threatened to dissolve back into the same blind panic that had started it all. Dr. Vale's instinct, the instinct of every decent person in that section, was to rush in toward the trapped under the swinging steel, and it was exactly the wrong instinct, because a rescuer crushed by the second failure is not a rescuer anymore. He is another casualty and a subtraction from everyone he might have saved. And Nora's voice cut across the section before anyone took a step, flat and absolute, the voice that had pulled people back from worse edges than this one, ordering them out from under the wounded span, marking the line with her pointing hand, this far and no farther until the structure is made safe. Get the ones already out moving, and leave the ones still pinned for the teams with the gear, because a hero who dies under the second collapse helps no one. It is the hardest order in disaster work, the order to not run in, and most people cannot give it, and most people will not obey it. And she gave it, and they obeyed it, because by now the whole arena had learned that when the gray-haired nurse with the stopwatch said a thing in that voice, she was right, and people who listened to her lived. She held that line hard against every good instinct in the room until Curtis Boyd's crews could rig a way to reach the last of the pins safely, and not one rescuer was lost under the second failure. And that, the disaster team would say later, the discipline of the line she drew under the swinging steel was its own kind of save, the invisible kind, the lives that were never spent because someone refused to let them be. There was a particular patient in the middle of all of it who would tell the story for the rest of her life, and her name was Marisol. a woman in her 30s who had come to the show with friends and been swept into the worst of the tunnel crush and pulled out gray and barely breathing, and she was one of the silent ones, one of the compression casualties that Dr. Vale had walked past because she made no noise, and she was, when Nora reached her, perhaps 4 minutes from death and entirely unaware of it, sitting propped against a pillar with her eyes half open and her chest barely moving, and the particular dusky gray color of a body that has been pressed past breathing and not yet started again. Anyone without the specific knowledge of the crush would have seen a dazed woman catching her breath and moved on to the screaming. Nora saw a woman dying in plain sight, and she dropped to her knees beside her and got her airway open and got oxygen on her and breathed for her, and she felt, under her hands, the deadly tightness building in one side of the chest, the air leaking into the wrong place where the crush had torn something, the pressure that would have stopped Marisol's heart inside the hour, and in the dim red light with Theo holding the small light from the kit, she put a needle into that chest in one clean, practiced motion and let the trapped pressure out, and Marisol drew, all at once, the first full breath she had drawn since the crowd took her. A long, ragged, whooping gasp that was the most beautiful sound in that whole terrible night, and her gray went to pink under Nora's hands, and she lived. She would learn, weeks later, in a follow-up she never expected, exactly how close she had come and exactly who had pulled her back, and she would learn the woman's name and the rank she had hidden, and she would be one of the dozens whose simple continued existence was the realest argument anyone could ever make for the worth of the nurse the arena had benched. Dr. Sebastian Vale, in all of this, went through the hardest hour of his life, and to his lasting credit, it broke something open in him rather than shutting him down. He had started the night certain he was in command, and had discovered, in the space of a few minutes, that he was a man flailing in deep water, while a stranger he had despised swam circles around him, and there is no harder thing for a proud man to face than that. For a little while he kept trying to do it his way, kept gravitating to the loudest and most visible casualties, kept narrating his own competence, and then, somewhere in there, watching Nora pull a gray and pulseless young man back from death with her hands and her stopwatch while he himself stood holding gauze he no longer knew what to do with, the pride simply ran out of him, all at once, the way it does, and what was left underneath it was a frightened, capable man who finally understood that he was not the one who knew what to do, and that the only intelligent thing left for him to do was to find the person who did and become useful to her. So he did the bravest thing he had ever done, which was to walk up to the nurse he had benched 4 hours earlier and say, "Tell me what to do. You're running this. I'll do whatever you say." And Nora Keene looked at him for half a second, took his measure the way she took everything, saw the change in him and decided it was real, and did not waste the moment on being right. She said, "Good. You've got hands and you've got training. Go to that line there, the ones who can wait but are bleeding, work down it, control what you can, and call me only for the ones who are sliding. Don't camp on one patient. Keep moving." And he went, and he did it, and he was, with her holding the shape of the whole thing above him, finely and genuinely useful, a good clinician at last doing good work inside a system built by someone who knew how to build one, and he would understand later that the most important thing he learned that night was not a procedure, but the size of his own ignorance and the name of the person who had filled it. The help, when it began to arrive, came slowly and from the storm, the first crews fighting their way through the jammed streets and the downed lines, and among the very first through the doors was a small fast team in plain dark response jackets with the grime of the night already on them, a disaster medical assistance team that had been mustered the instant the scale of it became clear, and at their head was a weathered man in his 50s with a steady manner and calm eyes that had seen this before, the kind of man who walks into a catastrophe and takes its measure in one slow sweep. His name was Raymond Okafor, and he had been to more disasters in his life than most people have heard of, and he came through the doors of that overrun arena expecting to find the usual thing, a scene barely holding, terrified amateurs doing their frantic best, and what he found instead stopped him cold in the doorway. He found a floor. He found order in the dark. He found casualties sorted into clean categories and a triage line that was working, and bystanders turned into stretcher teams and a tourniquet with the time written on the skin beside it, and a compression asphyxia casualty being correctly resuscitated by a young tech under direction, and he found, in the center of it all, a gray-haired woman in arena scrubs, moving through the chaos with a brass stopwatch in her hand and the unmistakable bearing of someone who had run a mass casualty floor for a living, and Raymond Okafor stood in that doorway and felt the recognition rise in him before he even saw her face, because he knew that bearing he had been trained in part by people who had it, and there were not many people on earth who carried it. And then she turned, and he saw her face, and the recognition finished itself, and the whole night cracked open. Because Raymond Okafor knew exactly who she was. He had been a young medic half a lifetime ago on one of those disaster deployments. In the dust of a city a quake had flattened, and he had watched the chief nurse of an airborne field hospital unit run a casualty floor through 3 days and nights of pulling the crushed out of the rubble, and he had learned, watching her, half of what he knew, and he had never in his life forgotten the woman who taught it to him by doing it in front of him when he was too young and too scared to do anything but follow. He crossed that room, through all of it, and he stopped in front of her, and for a moment the disaster-hardened commander could not quite speak, and then he found the word, and he said it, quietly, the way you say a thing you thought you would never say again. Commander Keene. And the suite, or as much of it as was close enough to hear, went still, even in the middle of everything, because the staff who had spent the night realizing they had been wrong about her now, heard in 2 words from a stranger who had walked in out of a disaster, exactly how wrong and exactly who she was. "It's Nora now," she said, not stopping her hands, because there were still people dying and a name was not worth a pause. "I left the rank a long time ago, Raymond." And Raymond Okafor, who had not been called by his first name by this woman in 20 years and felt it land in his chest like a door opening onto his own youth, did the only thing there was to do, which was to come, for 1 second, in the middle of a disaster to attention, and bring his hand up in a slow, clean salute to the woman who had once run the floor he was now standing on, a salute that was not about rank or ceremony, but about the simple unpayable debt of a man to the person who taught him how to save lives, and then he dropped his hand and said, "Tell me where you want my team, Commander," and put himself and his crew under her direction, because in the middle of a mass casualty there was no question, none, whose floor this was, and it was not the famous physician's, and it had never been. It was hers. It had been hers from the second she walked back through that door with a stopwatch in her hand. The arrival of the help brought its own hard problem, the one civilians never anticipate and disaster veterans always dread, which is that when the ambulances finally begin to fight their way in, there are never enough of them at once, and someone has to decide, fast and out loud and without flinching, who goes in the first truck and who waits, knowing that for some of the waiting the wait will be too long. The first 2 ambulances reached the loading bay through the wreck of the storm, and there were 40 people who needed them and 4 spaces, and Raymond Okafor turned to Nora, because of course he turned to Nora, and asked who went, and she did not hesitate, because hesitation at that moment is itself a kind of killing. She walked the line one more time with her stopwatch in her hand, fast, reading each casualty in seconds, and she made the calls aloud, this one and this one in the first truck because they are sliding and a few minutes will decide them. This one waits because she is bad, but she is stable and will hold. This one waits because, hard as it is, he will live whether he goes now or in 20 minutes, and the space is worth more spent on the one who will not. And she sent the trucks out loaded with the people the trucks could actually save, and she held the rest on the floor she had built, alive, with her hands and Sebastian's and the disaster team's, until the next trucks came. And there was a moment in there, a genuinely terrible one, when one of the patients she had marked to wait began, suddenly, to slide, a man whose crushed pelvis had been bleeding into him slower than she had judged, and now faster, his pressure falling away under her hands, and a lesser clinician would have frozen on the wrongness of the call. But Nora did not waste a second on having been wrong. She simply reread him and resorted him on the spot, and got him into the very next truck, and put a hand on the bleeding, and rode the decision forward, because the whole creed of the work is that the situation changes, and you change with it, and you do not fall in love with your own last assessment. And the man lived, and Sebastian, watching her revise a life and death judgment in real time without an instant of ego, understood that he had just seen the actual difference between competence and mastery, and that he had spent a season sneering at it. And Dr. Sebastian Vale, working his line a few feet away, heard the name and saw the salute, and the last of the man he had been that morning quietly died, and something better took its place. He understood in that moment the entire shape of his own foolishness, that he had spent a season mocking the stopwatch and the coin and the drills of a woman who had run casualty floors in fallen cities while he was still in school, that he had benched, on the worst night of his life, the single most qualified human being in the building, that everything he had taken for her smallness had been, in fact, the stillness of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone, and had simply been waiting quietly for the night the world would need her to prove it. And he did not feel, as he might have expected, only shame, though there was plenty of that. He felt something stranger and more useful, which was gratitude, the pure relief of a drowning man who has just watched a stranger arrive who actually knows how to swim, and under it the first faint understanding that he had just been handed, by catastrophe, the chance to learn from someone who could make him a fraction of the clinician she was, if he was humble enough to take it. The work went on for hours, because a disaster does not end when its hero is recognized. It ends when the last salvageable life has been salvaged and the last patient has been moved out to the care they need, and Nora Keene ran it the whole way, through the slow arrival of more crews and ambulances fighting in through the storm, through the long, grim sorting and the loading and the handing off, holding the shape of it in her head, never camping on one patient, always moving, keeping the floor she had built standing until there was a real system around it strong enough to take the weight, and only then, slowly, letting Raymond Okafor and his team and the arriving city crews take it from her piece by piece. The casualties went out into the night in a long stream, the gray ones she had breathed back to life, and the crushed ones she had sealed, and the cut ones she had packed, far more of them alive than had any right to be, and the people who would tally it later, the reviewers and the city and the disaster team, would all come to the same conclusion by different roads, that the thing that had decided who lived and who died in that arena was the first hour, the hour before the help could fight its way through the storm, the hour a benched nurse had stood in the center of the dark with a stopwatch and built a system where there had been only chaos. And somewhere in the gray, exhausted hours after the worst of it had passed, when the floor was finally in other hands and the survivors were moving out and the staff who had worked beside her all night were sitting against the walls of the suite, hollowed out by what they had seen and done, they asked her, the way people always ask, where she had learned it, and she told them, because the night had earned it. She told them about the man the stopwatch and the coin had come from. She told them about her old unit chief, the senior officer who had built that casualty floor and taught her everything, the man who had pressed the brass stopwatch into her hands on her first bad deployment when a crowd of the crushed came in all at once and she stood frozen at the edge of it, and told her that a nurse who cannot keep time and keep her head when the dying come in a flood is not yet ready for the work that matters, and that the stopwatch was so she would always have a way to hold on to the one thing a disaster tries hardest to take from you, which is the steady measured rhythm of a person who refuses to panic. And she told them how he had pressed the coin into her palm at the end of the worst stretch of all, in the dust of a fallen city, and told her that people who do what they did do not get parades, they get to go home, and the coin is so that on the days the world tells you that you are nothing, you remember the nights you were everything. And she told them that he had not gotten to go home, that he had been killed on a deployment much like this one, working in the dust over someone else, when a second collapse came down on a building everyone had thought was safe, and that she carried the stopwatch and the coin not as a memorial but as a working tool and a working creed, because he had been right, the disaster does come, and the only honest way to honor him was to be, always, ready for the night it did. There was, she said, a letter, folded small in her locker, that he had left for the people of his unit, and she could quote the last line of it from memory, and she did, into the gray dawn quiet of that battered arena. Be the calm. When everything else fails, be the calm, and the rest can be rebuilt. And the people who heard it understood, at last, the whole of the woman, and where the calm had come from, and what it had cost. Dr. Sebastian Vale found her alone a little after that, in the first real light of morning, when the storm had blown itself out and the arena was waking into the enormous work of cleaning up after a night like that one. He had been rehearsing what to say for an hour and had thrown all of it away because everything he came up with was about him, about his guilt, his apology, his need to be forgiven, and somewhere in that long dark night he had learned just enough to understand that an apology that is really about the person giving it is not an apology at all. So when he finally stood in front of her, he kept it simple. "I benched you," he said. "I sent you off the floor and told you we didn't need you on the worst night this building has ever had, and I was wrong about you in every way a person can be wrong about another person. I'm not going to ask you to forgive me because you don't owe me that, and I'm not going to pretend one bad night taught me everything because it didn't, but I wanted to say it to your face, with no one else here. I was wrong, Commander, and I have a great deal to learn, and you are the person at this arena I most need to learn it from, and I know I have no right to ask." And Nora Keene looked at him for a long moment, at the polished young physician stripped all the way down to something honest at last, and she did not gloat, and she did not wave it away, because both of those would have been a kind of lie. She just said, "It's Nora, in this suite. I left the rank in another country, and you're not a bad clinician, Sebastian. You were just an untested one. Now you know what it's like when the system doesn't come and the help isn't there. Don't waste it." And it was, in its way, the most generous thing she could have said, because it was the truth, and it left him a door to walk through, and he knew it, and he nodded, and for once in his life he did not say anything else. The reckoning with Howard Lindqvist was quieter and, in its way, more complete, because it required nothing of Nora at all. The administrator came to the suite late the next day, once the story of the night had gone through the arena and then through the city, the story of the storm and the roof and the crush, and the nurse who had run the whole thing in a dark arena with a stopwatch, the story that the disaster team and the saved survivors and Dr. Vale himself were all telling the same way, and he came with his file in his hand and a great many things he had planned to say, and he found that there was no version of any of them that survived contact with what had actually happened. The drills he had written up as unauthorized had saved the building. The stage kit he had flagged as a violation had been the first thing she reached for. The stopwatch he had called a professionalism concern had timed the resuscitations that pulled the gray ones back. Every single item in his careful file was, it turned out, evidence of exactly the opposite of what he had built it to prove, and the formal counseling notice she had signed without complaint now read, to anyone who saw it, as the most damning thing in the building, a record of an institution writing up the one person who was ready for the disaster it had told her could not happen. He did not, in the end, say much of anything. He took his file away, and it was never spoken of again, and that was its own kind of justice, the quiet kind, the kind that does not need a confrontation because the facts have already won. The casualties from that torn roof and that terrible crush lived, far more of them than anyone had any right to expect from a sold-out arena that lost its roof and jammed its gates in the dark an hour from the nearest trauma center, on a night the roads were closed. The crushed and the trampled and the quiet gray ones who would have slipped away unattended in a less ordered place. The young man whose pulse Nora had brought back with her hands and her stopwatch, the woman whose chest she had decompressed with a needle in the dark, the man whose leg she had saved with a tourniquet, timed and called aloud, dozens upon dozens of people who walked out of that story alive because a benched nurse had built a system in a dark concourse and held it together until the help could fight its way through Starunderstierman. And when the formal review came, weeks later, the reviewers wrote, in the careful language such reports use, that the survival outcomes were attributable in significant part to the actions of the on-site medical staff and one nurse in particular, whose leadership during the incident had been, the report said, exemplary. Nora Keene read that line once, in the sweet break room with her thumb on the worn coin, and then she set the report down and went back to work, because a line in a report was not why she had done any of it, and she had learned a long time ago not to need the world to write down what she already knew. The salute that the genre promises, the public moment of recognition, did come, but it came the way real recognition comes to people like Nora Keene, sideways and quiet and on her own terms. There was no ceremony because she would not have one, but the arena changed. There were new drills now, real ones that operations not only permitted but required, crowd crush drills and structural failure drills and mass casualty drills, and Nora ran them, and the sweet staff came, Sebastian first among them, and learned from her how to run a disaster when the help is far away and the plan has fallen apart, and learned, more importantly, the thing the night had taught them all, which is that the person who knows the actual work is worth more than the person who has only ever had the polished version of it, and that you can never tell from the title or the age or the gray hair or the battered stopwatch who in the room that person is going to turn out to be. And the young ones, Theo and the ushers, who had carried and held pressure and counted to her in the dark, who had watched the woman they overlooked save them all, carried that lesson out into their own lives, into places Nora would never see, and that, more than any salute, was the real vindication, the kind that does not end when the applause stops because it goes on living in the people it changed. Theo, the young tech who had become her hands in the dark, changed the most, and changed for good. In the weeks after, while the rest of the staff slowly folded the night away into the place where you keep the things you survived, Theo started showing up early, before his shifts, the way Nora always had, and asking her to teach him, and she did, because the one thing she had never been able to refuse in all her years was a young person who genuinely wanted to learn the work. She taught him the way the chief had taught her, by doing it in front of him and then making him do it. The triage categories and the order of the airway and the feel of a chest that is filling and the brutal arithmetic of who first, and she taught him the thing under all of it, the steadiness, how to feel his own fear climb and set it down and keep his hands moving and his voice low. He would go on, that young man, years later to run a casualty floor of his own in a hard place, and on his own worst night he would hear her voice in his head telling him to be the calm, and he would be. And people he would never connect to a gray-haired arena nurse would live because of it, and that is how the real things move through the world, quietly, from the overlooked to the unborn, never showing up in any report. The first real drill came a month after the storm, on an empty afternoon before the doors opened, and it was the strangest meeting that Medical Suite had ever held, because the man running the room was not the famous physician, but the gray-haired nurse, and the famous physician was sitting in the front row with a notebook like a first-year student, and so was Curtis Boyd, and so were the ushers and the security teams and the operations staff. All the people who had once walked past Nora Keene without seeing her, now leaning forward to catch every word. She walked them through it without drama, the crush and the collapse and the dark, where the choke points were and how fast a crowd compresses, and why the silent ones die first and the loud ones almost never do, how to turn bystanders into hands, how to keep time when the dying come in a flood, and she did it in the plain, unhurried voice of someone for whom this was not theory, and the room understood, watching her, that they were being taught by someone who had earned every sentence in places they could not imagine. Even Howard Linkfist came once and stood at the back and said nothing and left early, and the drills he had written her up for were now, by his own signature, a permanent requirement of the building. And Marisol, the woman Nora had brought back from the gray against a pillar, came to the arena one evening that fall, well and whole, to find the nurse and thank her. And Nora, who had never in her life known how to be thanked, simply held the younger woman's hands for a moment and told her to go live a good long life, because that was the whole of the point, and that was payment enough, and watched her walk back out into the ordinary evening she had almost not had. And Nora Keene went back to being a nurse, which was all she had ever wanted to be, at a busy modern arena medical suite that now understood finally what it had in her, though she would have been just as steady if it never had. She still worked the quiet, thankless cases and the late shows nobody else would take. She still moved through that building the way still water moves, slow and certain and easy to underestimate, except that no one underestimated her anymore. And on the first quiet afternoon after it was all over, before the doors opened on an ordinary show, she did the thing she always did at the start of a shift. The small ritual she had carried home from another life, she took the battered brass-cased field stopwatch on its faded olive ribbon, and she pressed her thumb to the cool brass and felt the weight of it and the faint click of the crown. The stopwatch that had kept the rhythm of a dozen lives being pulled back across the line on the worst night any of them had known, and then she let it go, and she clipped it to her badge beside the dull gray coin, and she squared the badge reel against her chest and rolled her shoulders once and stepped out onto the concourse to do her job, ready, the way she had promised a dead man she would always be ready, for the next ordinary night that might not stay ordinary. That is the thing about the people we are too quick to write off. The quiet ones, the older ones, the ones who carry strange small tools and ask the questions no one wants to hear and never tell you what they have already lived through. The world looks at them and sees the past, sees someone slow, sees someone finished, and tells them to stay in their lane and sends them off the floor. And then, on the night the roof comes open and the crowd comes down, and everything that was supposed to save you simply fails to come, the world finds out that the person it benched was the only one who ever knew what to do. Nora Keene never asked anyone to see her. She only ever asked to be allowed to do the work. But there are some people whose worth will not stay hidden forever, because sooner or later a night comes that needs exactly what they are, and on that night the room finally sees and is humbled and is saved. So here is what I want to leave you with tonight. When you think of the moment Commander Nora Keene became undeniable, was it the instant she stepped into the center of a screaming room, lifted an old stopwatch, and told 100 terrified people that there was a system now and she was it? Or was it the moment a disaster commander walked in out of the storm, came to attention on that dark floor, and called her by the name she had hidden for years? Tell me in the comments which one was the real turning point for you, and tell me about the quiet person in your own life that the world was wrong about. That was tonight's story from Unspoken Valor. Some heroes never ask to be seen, but they are always, in the end, worth the salute.